So we are here today to welcome two people who are going to talk about archiving art in Iran, or in and from Iran. First of all, we have Kimia, who will be our main event. Kimia Maleki, she got her MA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago with Nora A, who we will introduce in a little while. And she did her MA's thesis on exactly this subject, the state of art archiving in Iran. And Kimia did her BA degree in Tehran, the University of Arts in Tehran. Nora, who will be her partner tonight, but is also her venerable professor, the Aldars Professor of South and Southeast Asian Art History at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And Nora, I know Nora very well. She's a very good friend and advisor of Asia Art Archive, and her specialty has been Southeast Asia, and in particular Vietnam, and wrote a book which I think you all should have. It looks like it's been published twice. It's in its second edition, called Painters in Hanoi, an ethnography of Vietnamese art. So we're going to focus on Iran today, which is sort of an unusual departure for us, but because we're an archive and because we specialize in or try to promote archiving around the world in areas where there's less institutional support for that, we're delighted to have you. So, Kimia. Yay.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your introduction, and thanks for inviting me. And also, I would like to thank Claire Sue, the Executive Director of Asia Art Archive, who actually I was introduced by Nora, and I had a chance to interview her for my project. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna present about my project and how it started, from where it started, and on what the stage now it is. And then we're gonna talk with Nora about some comparison with some countries that she's expressed. She has been done so much work on them. And then we're gonna also listen and hear your questions and your suggestions. At the bottom of my family's apartment in Tehran was a big library whose contents my father spent years collecting. In that humid basement library were an abundance of handwritten texts and magazines printed on rough paper. Before the advent of dial-up internet in the 90s to our home, I would spend hours down there leafing through old magazines and books like Kayhan Farhangi, a cultural magazine whose editions from the 1960s and 70s depicted an Iran before the revolution, with homes, lifestyles, and gossip to match. A few years later, like many buildings in various neighborhoods of Tehran, we decided to update and rebuild our home, and tentatively remove the library. My father had noticed that the old building of our home wasn't stable anymore for my generation, and a cost to daily repair was frustrating. He also had noticed the booming price of land in the decades after the end of the war, when prices went through the ceiling in all major Iranian cities as a result of a building boom. And like many constructions happening these days in Iran, instead of rebuilding the private library, it was decided to add more apartments units to make the building taller rather than making up and having a place to keep materials. This resulted in the displacement of a huge collection of series of magazines, books, manuscripts, and even lithograph books from my grandfather and father's generation. As things were moving fast, we had to look for potential places to donate some of the books. Books that fit the criteria of the Islamic Republic's publishing guidelines, like the many brilliant political and religious treatises, were donated to several universities' libraries, which had enough storage spaces and also human resources to catalog and accept the new donation. On the other hand, magazines, ephemera, and many other documents that didn't fit the official criteria of what constitute worthy literature included all lifestyle, art, and gossip magazines, among many other of my favorite journals and magazines, were wrapped and carried away in a blue Nissan van, taken to be recycled. So, blue Nissan van is a very iconic thing in Iran, so I want to emphasize on that. And also, I also want to emphasize that I'm speaking about the desired and official and something as a form, like books versus magazines and ephemera and documents. However, at the time, I was unable to stop the destruction of this home library. As an observer, I began to look for potential ways to preserve such archives. I began to recognize the value and power of the archive and to think about parallel repositories in many houses scattered across the country that were being discarded daily. How many libraries full of one-of-a-kind journals and magazines from before the revolution were being callously discarded as a result of new construction schemes that promised quick money to their owners? How many priceless treasures of the past were destroyed by owners unaware of the potential significance of these documents as records of Iran's thriving art scene and social history? The concern about the lack of Iranian contemporary art history led me to think about factors that has through the time caused the lack of a written art history of Iranian contemporary art inside the country that traces its development throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. At the heart of this problem, I realized, was the lack of an archive that could be used as a source to write such a history of Iranian contemporary art history. When there is no written art history, no critique follows. When there is no agency to preserve the ephemeral, there will be no written art history. I believe archiving begins as the preservation of materials, but over time it becomes an embedded practice in the culture, able to influence education. We can look at an archive as a set of behaviors and habits to preserve the past, which Iranians probably are not the best in it. In many countries, the notion of the archive and thinking about history and the past is an inherent part of the pedagogy and education system. Indian anthropologist Arjun Appadurai believes that after Foucault, we need a new way to look at the archive as a collective tool. This reminds us, in a country like Iran, where people are intimate and sincere with their own shared memories, how the archive as a tool that preserves these collective memory could become important for the public. The public that trusts a tool that is devoid of a governmental and political apparatus that leads to selective preservation practices and thus a selective protection of public memory that has led to public skepticism of official histories. But Appadurai doesn't continue in a way that it may be expected, recognizing that the archive is not just a way to preserve accidental but precious traces of collective memory. We need also to see that perhaps Foucault had too dark a vision of the panoptical functions of the archive, of its role as an accessory to policing, surveillance, and governmentality. The fear that he points to is a real one in Iranian society, that archives could be used as sources against people. But how then do we create an archive that is both transparent and protected, neutral and independent? How can an archive be on the edge of the government and artist trust? How can an archive successfully earn this trust without confronting sensitive political issues? How can one institution fill the gap between a state-sponsored and independent organization? Can this archive live inside Iran, or will it need to be housed outside the country?
It's not changing slightly.
So here, I'm going to speak about my research and fieldwork briefly into existing archives in Iran and around the world, finishing with some questions about moving forward as well as suggestions for construction of such an archive. The Iranian art scene through the past decade has been one of the most flourished, dynamic phenomena in the region. Every year, many galleries open, auctions, which wouldn't be that much helpful for underrepresented artists, also happening. And There are also blossoming, flourishing creativity that has led to the emergence of hundreds of art galleries all over the country. There are a good number of young artists working in their studios in Iran. Also, a good number of established artists with great source of materials who have been targeted by international curators. I only came to understand the power of the archive after I came to the US to study at the Art Institute of Chicago and began working at the institutional archive there. I began to recognize how touching a document from a previous century made me think about the reasons behind my lack of this kind of experience before. Before that, I only had experience of requesting documents in Iranian archives to be scanned without having a chance to touch them. At official archives in Iran, the public is not trusted to interact directly with historical documents. Instead, I could remember how I had a chance to hug a pillar from centuries ago, or stand in a mosque from centuries ago, or touch a carpet from decades ago. But I never had a chance to easily touch documents and materials written in ink. The experience was limited to our private library, which was limited to those magazines and few handwritten books by my grandfathers. Before delving into my argument about the current and possible places to keep materials and documents related to Iranian contemporary art, I would like to take a moment to talk about the history of archiving in Iran. It's quite a repetitive nationalistic approach in presentation on Iran to start by talking about the great Persian Empire. But I still feel the need to mention that indeed Persians were one of the best civilizations in archiving historically. It has been proved. In Archives and Libraries in the Ancient Near East, the book, the author mentions various times that how Alexander the Great promoted the importance of daily journals and of general record keeping, and how the Persian system was later incorporated by the Arabs, Mongols, Turks, Egyptians, Sicilians, and from there the Normans implemented and transferred the system of archiving to the first modern state of the West in modern Germany. I have had direct experience with this ancient Persian system of archiving as a project assistant at the Persepolis Fortification Archive at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, where I have daily contact with these 3,000 years old tablets. This experience has made me aware of how Persians in a time used to record concisely their daily lives on these clay tablets. During the realm of Achaemenid, the empire used to have royal archives fundamentally for administrative usage. The head of the state was the head of the royal archives, and he was responsible for recording official correspondence, regal comments, and other significant events of the day. So that's a picture I took when I was editing one of the tablets images the other day at the Oriental Institute. However, after the ancient Persia, during the Islamic period, we get to some instances of archiving, such as Arzadash, for instance, the other side. In 15th century, during the Timurid era, we have a very unique report from the head of Baysongor's court library for artistic production, writing to King of Timurid on updates and progress about the illumination and calligraphy on the paintings and other related projects that they're supposed to be done. This piece is one of the few kinds that our art historian could rely on to learn about the artistic production of at that time. But as mentioned, this is only very exceptional document remained from the time that we can actually call it as an archive. Like it was supposed to be for just report, as a document to report to the court. The word archive, as used in the West, does not have a direct translation in Persian. Instead, it comes from the French archive, or archive also. The first encounter with the word archive for any Iranian raised in Iran would be watching the state TV and news channel. Colloquially, the word archive is used to show previously recorded video footage in television news programming. Actually, so I looked a lot to find that the archive word, and this is from the TV news channel. So over there now it says live, like Zende, but I was looking for archive, so I couldn't find the archive one. But just to show what the footage is, that's the first time that everyone encounters the word archive in Iran. in the meaning of archive footage. Although the word archive is available in the Persian lexicon, there is currently no organization titled with this name. The confusion that usually happens in the translation of the word archive is the difference between archives and records. Even though there is no understanding of archive, it should be mentioned that every official institution has an internal system of archiving called baigani, which actually basically is record keeping. So certain aspects of archival practice are already there. They are just not recognized as such. I want to speak of these places in some detail to give you a sense of broad spectrum of the notion of archiving art in Iran. So my research proved me that the archive could take many forms, and as my limitations all me, I could explore many archives in person and some virtually. So the acronym NLI in English signifies the National Library and Archives of Islamic Republic of Iran. So this building. While in Persian, it becomes the Organization for National Documents and Library. Thus, the Persian translation still references how this place collects documents and is not an archive, which are two separate things. Basically, NLI functions as a storage facility for hundreds of precious, old and handwritten manuscripts and documents. The National Archive of Iran collects only historical material, and contemporary galleries have limited their practice to archiving their own exhibition ephemera. And another place that I guess I really wanted to find an archive, and I expected to find an archive, was the Terra Museum of Contemporary Art, which is well known for its famous and comprehensive collection of artworks, which is acclaimed as the most extensive collection of modern Western art outside of the Western world. Developed in the 1970s, the collection includes works by Andy Warhol, Picasso, Kandinsky, Mark Rothko, and many more. Going through Kamran Diba talks. So Kamran Diba is a very well-known Iranian architect who built this, who designed the Terra Museum of Contemporary Art. Also, he was a director of the museum for several the beginning years. So when I went through his talk, I didn't see anywhere that he would mention that I designed like an archive for this museum. So he designed a library, but there is nothing about archive. And so I approached the deputy director of the museum, and he accepted to talk to me. And I went to his office when I traveled to Tehran. And the first question I asked was, do you have archive of artists here, or do you have any art archive here? And he was like, yeah, we have a great collection of artworks here. And so that was, again, this kind of confusion between the word ganjine, which is collection, and archive. Like, so when I said archive, he thought I'm talking about the collection. And so that was a confusion that came up in other interviews as well. So, and he said, no, we don't have any archive, and we only have one folder for each artwork, that some of them are also empty. Like, they even don't have some receipts and receipts for the artworks. And the other place that I thought maybe I could find an archive was Tandis magazine, which is a bi-weekly magazine of Iranian art. And I thought maybe because they have to write review for exhibitions, they may have an archive. And interestingly, the office in downtown Tehran was full of boxes, in dusty boxes, full of like ephemera and documents that I was looking for. But the director and the person that I talked to wasn't very kind of interested to have an interview with me. And when I said, oh, why don't you have the archive of these, why don't you catalog these materials? And he was like, oh, we only write review, and so here is our archive. And then when I said I want to create an archive of Iranian art, he was like, why do you want to do that? We already have an archive. So, but those were just boxes of materials over there. So, kind of as part of my research into the practice of archiving in Iran, my interviews with more than 30 people from the art scene of Iran, such as artists, art critics, art historians, and teachers that happened through 2015 and 2016 in Tehran, resulted in some major findings. These interviews were mainly done with the question of whether there were any present archive of Iranian contemporary art. I found there are several galleries and project spaces that partially started to collect some materials. As one of the interviewees claimed, the archive is gradually becoming very trendy these days in Iran. But as I have mentioned earlier, the definition of archive and its function is different, and is not fully shaped in local language. Through the process of interviewing these people from the art scene, the interest in creating an archive was obviously present. By talking about the project and possible models, this understanding came that everyone eager and excited about having an independent archive of contemporary art in Iran. It is important to mention that these people are all aware of the lack of the archive at the Museum of Contemporary Art and other galleries. They believe that documentation of the present needs a large foundation to sponsor the project, and it is important to have the infrastructure for the theory of archiving. As I move forward, I noticed the importance of theory for these interviewees and how it is important for them to have a theory behind the proposed project. So these are all spaces that recently opened in Iran, and I didn't have a chance to visit many of them, but just to give a sense of how much, so much is happening, but I'm not sure if anyone actually collecting and preserving documents from these places. So meanwhile, I began working in an archive of Iranian artists abroad. I started by taking recent immigrated Iranian artist students as a valuable source to start the conversation about the Iranian art scene in Chicago. As a pilot program to see how the previous generation of Iranian artists before the revolution came to study at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I juxtaposed artists such as Hannibal Akhas, Mehdi Hosseini, and others from 1950s, 60s, and 70s with the pieces by recent Iranian graduates of the same school who recently moved from Iran, and also bringing voices of those whose parents immigrated from Iran during the revolution all together. I curated an exhibition in Chicago last year that explored these connections as an initial step toward building a broader archive of Iranian art. The project's goal was to show another aspect of artists coming from Iran and the problems, issues, and obstacles they used to face and have been facing in terms of representation, impression, and biases in the criticism of their works. However, finding Hannibal Akhas' archive in his daughter's house in Wisconsin was a proof that the archive of Iranian contemporary art is not about the locality of this lack inside the country, more importantly as the lack of scholars in that and those who would like to document and pay attention. So those who have been aware of my project from the beginning, they know how the Asia Art Archive has been playing a really important role in my thesis and project. So for my project, for my thesis, I kind of analyze Asia Art Archive as a successful model and how it has been sustainable and how it has developed the geography. So I analyze all goals and aims, and I thought I couldn't be more happier to share my research tonight at Asia Art Archive, the place that when I started to do my research, I never thought that I'm going to do that. And also having some interviews here tonight in this room. And and at the end, I guess Nora would be the best person to follow the conversation.
Yeah. So I'll just, continue because I'm not an expert on Iran by any means. I've learned a lot from Kimia, and the best part about being a professor is that you learn from your students. But when she and I spoke, I of course spoke about Asia Archive. But one of the, it's interesting, you started this talk with, this dilemma of what to keep and what to discard. Mm-hmm. But you started with your own family's collection. But when you came to talk to me in Chicago you thought more about the future, but the future of the past. And your dilemma was, how can I create an archive? And how do I do that? And it became a little bit of a chicken or the egg story. Mm-hmm. Do I look for the material and then I create an archive of the material? Or do I know the art history, look for the material that fills that art history? And then she and I had very interesting conversations about that, the relationship between archive and art history. Mm-hmm. What builds what? Is the art history there and then you build an archive around that art history, or does the archive actually write the art history? So we had those kinds of exchanges. So I shared with her a few things about my experience in Southeast Asia, especially in Vietnam. when I wrote my book, Painters in Hanoi, I had to operate with the fact that there were no documents pertaining to contemporary art in Vietnam. My documents were living sources, were people, and I interviewed them and so forth. But I was making that assumption, and Kimia also came to me making that assumption. There is no archive in Iran. Mm-hmm. And then though, however, lo and behold, after a while you realize there are archives, but they're just not the kinds of archives that you expect to find. Mm-hmm. And so I had a similar experience in Vietnam and looking for documents because I was under the assumption that documents is what is going to write the art history that I wanted to write. And I went to actually in years after writing my dissertation, my book, actually I was at the first Asia Archive conference in 2005 called Documents for the Future, Documenting the Future, and where I was came across a variety of concepts around an archive. And one of the most illuminating was closer to my field of study, which was a discussion about Cambodia, where all documents were eradicated and erased from the physical documents were and records were erased. Books were burned, destroyed, and so forth. And but memory was still there. So there was this idea that actually an archive can be just in a memory, and there can be an archive where there is no archive. And that was very illuminating for me too. And so I was sharing that with Kimia as well. This idea that what is remembered and what is forgotten. And then we got into discussions about institutions and state institutions. And I had just, versus individuals. And I had just completed digitizing the archive of an independent space in Hanoi, Salon Tasha, where they had all of the documents, but no archive had been created with those documents. So that meant ordering them, sorting through them, not necessarily discarding anything, but just creating a space where one could contemplate what exactly was this history. And we could organize the material in such a way to make viewers engage with that history in an efficient way and in a way that is also closer to the reality of the space. And to do that via documents and do it virtually. And of course that space, Salon Tasha, was completely outside of official institutions. And in Vietnam there are still no official art institutions or culture. There is a national archive, but it's more military, army archives and so forth, but nothing pertaining to art. And so then I had just returned from sabbatical when I met Kimia, where I had written extensively about an individual's archive, Koh Won Hao, Singapore Art Archive project. And there was another interesting case of an archive where an individual had taken upon himself to collect all of the materials pertaining to events and exhibitions that took place in Singapore since the 1980s until the present, because no museum and no institution had kept those documents. So he was kind of the sole proprietor of all of this memory of all art events that took place, official and unofficial. So what interested me about Iran is a combination of all of those kinds of archives in a way, where you have a government, a national institution that is very selective in what it wants to keep and what it wants to discard, and will want to control the memory of its past. But your project is closer allied to these other kinds of projects that are, what about the independent spaces? What about individual archives? What about art historical narratives where the document doesn't exist anymore, but the narrative is there. It's somewhere kept in someone's memory, or it's recorded in some other way than through an archive. So the challenge of actually creating an archive, which is then looking to the future, And can we build an archive like that? So after you wrote your thesis and you'd explore this, what are your, projections on that idea of how do you build an archive now in Iran after you've done all of this research?
So I guess now I'm like very much more open to many forms, like other forms, as I mentioned, like when I was doing my research and I was, so that was the last time that I went to Iran, and I was just had this in mind, like, I want to go and make an archive, like Asia Art Archive in Iran, like, and I want to have a space, and so start collecting materials and digitize them. But at the same time, I was emphasizing that I want to take the discourse of archive to Iran. Just these questions, like in my interviews that I was saying, do you have archive? And people were thinking that I'm talking about collection, or like some other confusion that came up. I was just very determined that I have to take the vocabulary, the language, and the discourse. But I guess after doing the exhibitions in Chicago, and just finding the Hannibal Al-Khas archive in Milwaukee and working with diaspora, Iranian diaspora. So now I'm much more open, and I guess just very small steps also could be that archive that I have in mind, like that idealistic archive that I have in mind.
Well, I mean, I know in Vietnam that archives was not such a nice word for people. It was associated with government, and therefore people weren't interested. And documents, like books, in a lot of countries where the political situation is fraught, are dangerous. And so people keep things for themselves, but they don't want to share. And, I learned for Asia Archive is all about sharing. It's all about sharing documents, and that's why the digital platform is all about sharing. But in Vietnam, that's not something they would rather destroy immediately, and because it's dangerous to even possess something. So the concept of being able to build an archive was really anathemas to them. They didn't understand. But then I think that when we did set on Natasha archive, people, they wondered, they had a lot of questions, why this archive and not something else? But I think they began to see the value of having a document to speak of an art history that would otherwise be forgotten. But it took a long time for people to really understand that. And
so you think like this discarding process, was that more as a consequence of fear or more as not recognizing the value of the document?
I think both.
Both.
But
because
both. There is fear, but there's also that's why there's this chicken or the egg kind of thing that we talk about, because there's no value attached to the document, why keep it?
Right.
I was just telling the other day someone that when I first went to Hanoi in '92, I would buy sticky rice from a woman who would rip pages out of a book to serve the rice. And I looked at the pages of the book one time, and it was Marxist-Lenin ideology. But it was this idea that why keep anything? You can just recycle it in some way. So who would keep it? But there was an interesting moment in Vietnam where the Museum of Ethnography had an exhibition on the subsidy period of the 1980s, when people were very poor in Vietnam and they had all food was rationed and so forth. And they put out a call for the population to give them any ephemera that they had saved from that time period. And of course, a lot of people, it was a joke. We didn't save, that was a horrible time in our lives. Why would we save a food coupon? Now we can buy them with money. And but there were people who saved it. They managed to get something. And that apparently that exhibition in that museum was the most widely attended exhibition in the history of all exhibitions. It wasn't in an art museum, although if you go to the Guggenheim Zenwald, it could have been that kind of exhibition. But people then, that's when they understood maybe that ephemera had some value because we remember, and we are interested in remembering that time period. But so I think that it is that it could build up. You display, like you did with the show in Chicago. You showed that those documents have a purpose. So then people might say, oh, I have some documents too, and then they would contribute. But it has to start with some display of the value of those documents. That happened to me, or when I did my research, I found a woman who used to be the secretary of the Official Art Association, and she said, I have all of these documents if you want, because I said, oh, there wasn't documents, and she said, well, I have some documents, and she showed them to me. They said I kept them because normally they would have been shredded, but I actually kept a few, just like one or two things. And I looked at them and said, oh, that's very interesting, and can I photocopy them? I said, sure. And then many years later, there was a project to digitize some documents related to Doi Mai and the economic reforms in Vietnam, and I went back to her and I said, you know, I lost that photocopy that I made because I didn't actually keep that one, because I wrote about it in my thesis. Could we scan it? Because the photocopy was a bad quality anyway. I couldn't have. So I said, can you scan it? Because there's a project about documents. And she kind of hesitated a lot, and she wasn't telling me. And then afterwards, a friend of mine went with me because I said, I don't know why she doesn't want to just give me so we can scan it. 15 years earlier, I could photocopy it. Why can't I scan it? What's the problem? Is there a confusion over what scanning does and so forth? And then Manfred said, no, she wants money. So that was the difference suddenly. Suddenly there was this idea that the document had monetary value, and it didn't even occur to me. So I don't know how that happened, but this kind of thing may happen, where there's an interest if the document pertains to a period of art history that suddenly becomes interesting, and there are artists that are shown in galleries, and there's an interest in them. Suddenly the document itself has that kind of market.
Actually, who do I want to select and who I don't want to select? Because at that time, if you remember, like we were talking about the market and like the interest of the like a Western market on Iranian art, and the
and we were talking also about which artists are there, and do you go and say, okay, I like these artists, so I'm going to find the documents pertaining to these artists, or do you go and find what documents you have, and then you kind of decide that's where it always is. It was difficult to decide to engage in. But there's the same thing with the Salon Natasha archive they did. There were a lot of people who were questioning, why that space, or couldn't you have found another space? And the thing is that, well, we couldn't really do another space because the other spaces didn't keep their materials. So, but I mean, it so happens though that space was important, more important than another space, and it so happened that space also kept its materials, but maybe because it was in such an important space, they kept the materials. So it's also how they see themselves, and they construct their own identity in a way. Should we turn it to the... Sure. But Kimia and I had lots of really theoretical, conceptual concepts of what actually constitutes an archive and how do we build one, because I would tell her the story that Claire always tells, and about starting with a shoebox and filling it up with documents, but then it becomes this whole universe of sharing information, sharing, and so forth. So that was the other thing, is that the audience, sharing, for whom would an archive be for in this kind of new contemporary archive. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you both. It was really, really good talk, both of you. And following the conversation, I thought maybe it just came to my mind that also, like, one thing in Iran that happened that you also mentioned, and you too, that in one period it was just all these international curators that got attracted to Iranian contemporary art. And the very interesting thing is we don't have any Iranian catalog or like in Farsi for like a period of 15 years. So any artist that is active in Iran in that period that was very like hype for international and Western market, there is no single catalog that any Iranian wrote about it. And that also, I guess, gives us this notion that what is the true archive? The archive and the fact and the knowledge that a Westerner creates for that nation. So it's been always like
Yeah,
a
and
curiosity.
it isn't because there's no catalog that artist didn't exist. So it's how do you remedy that? And I know that in Cambodia, especially, there was this notion of someone coined this phrase for an exhibition, the legacy of absence. Like, how do you register an absence?
Mhm.
And that's kind of this idea too, that if there's no catalog for 15 years,
Yeah.
how do you register?
I mean, there
that
are
period?
catalogs, but
Yeah.
there are like the depiction and the story of a Westerner,
Yeah.
of
Right.
an Iranian artist.
Right.
So that's one issue that is good to be addressed. Another thing that you beautifully said, and I also as like a live person from that generation, something that we shouldn't forget is not about, you mentioned a little bit that it's about safety, it's about a safe place, it's about like we're hiding things because we don't want to archive because the government is anyway wants to gather all this information and use it against us as artists. But at the same time, I think something that my generation firsthand really sensed it was the self-censorship that was very, very hidden, very subconscious at the moment. But now when I think about it, we don't have as an individual any archival materials for our own works because we didn't want to have any trace even in our own mind, let alone to just print it and give it to a deputy of like a Ministry of Culture, because it wasn't about safety, but also it was about like staying in this anonymous mode. So it was just kind of like, I guess it became like a behavioral condition of being. And still like when you're far from that, and still that is trendy, that archiving everything, like much more than all those organizations that you showed even. But it's still, I guess, it's just so woven to the culture and to the psychology of people that it's hard to
Yeah, and that's an
really-
interesting point in terms of like the diaspora, because as opposed to the people who stay there in country, because the diaspora and first of all, when you leave your country, you're more apt to leave behind things, but then you're also more apt to reconstruct what you left behind when you're away, and then more freely than when you're, and then the people who are behind might be more apt to destroy things if they're afraid. So there's this difference in terms of the artists in the diaspora. So when you went to Milwaukee, it was really revealing for you because there's someone in the diaspora who had all these things.
Yeah.
That so there's distance and time and place that creates different behaviors of what you keep and what you discard too, which is really interesting.
Yeah, just speaking of the lack of that catalog, I guess I forgot to mention, like before writing my thesis, another project that I did for James Elkin's class was the lack of Iranian contemporary art history, that I was kind of following these kind of books on Iranian contemporary art history and finding someone who grew up in Iran and wrote about the Iranian art history. Like, I was finding people who actually wasn't like part of the Iranian education system for their undergrad, which was like something that I guess very formative. And so I couldn't find. And so this kind of led me to lack of contemporary art history, led me to the lack of archive. And so we were talking about, okay, so the chicken question came out of there. Like, was that first archive, that art history? So because of the lack of archive, you don't have the contemporary art history, or because of the lack of art history, we don't have that?
Okay, right.
I have both a comment and a question.
Yeah.
Actually, the situation is not as bad as it sounds here, and I think that this lamentation may be caused more by fractured archives. It's no archive, but there are many archives. And it's not actually true that it's only Westerners' view, because last 15 years of exhibitions and contemporary art and events have been very well documented by Amir Ali Qasimi and Bazar Mahmoudian. It was also exhibited at Bruges and
Yeah, and I'm aware of that project, so I can talk
yeah,
about that.
so it's basically we can say that it's somebody else only from outside is doing it, because Amir Ali is doing it very well from inside.
Yeah, Amir Ali was one of my interviews. Azar also was the person that I talked to, so I am aware of their projects. But the project that they started in Belgium, and they showed that, so it stopped in 2014. So you know, like there have been all these kind of like independent works that kind of started as a project, but as an institution. So if you saw my presentation, I'm talking about like institutional work of something that happening, kind of trying to document the work that Amir Ali is doing. You know, like someone as a kind of holistically, like comprehensively, holistically working and kind of without being biased, being neutral, and also sustainable. Like the thing that I'm talking about, like this sustainability that I'm impressed by for the Asia Art Archive is something that I'm trying to kind of emphasize on.
Right. We were talking about sustainability, and just the other day we were talking about what that means.
Right.
Yeah. Does it mean having, you know, we were talking about this digital platform, or I was sharing with her this idea of the digital platform for our archive, which is sustainable in this as long as that technology remains in place, but it's in that more users and over a longer period of time than an actual physical document that might wear and tear more easily. So you have that's more sustainable in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, if the technology completely changes, you still have to have the original document from which to digitize. So there was this idea of sustainability is also embedded in archiving processes. I have a mother who used to put photographs in acid-free envelopes for some reason, because she was so afraid that the photograph
kind of tried to be kind of obstacle for them. And as I did interview, and also I wrote a paper, what factors are changing Iranian artist students' work when they move from Iran to the US, I figured out, so this is something that wasn't maybe the case in 60s or 70s. And then I figured out Hannibal al-Khas and Mehdi Hosseini, like some of the main figures of Iranian painting art, came to SAIC. And I tried to contact Hannibal al-Khas' daughter and also Mehdi Hosseini, who is teaching at the Tehran Art University. And I've talked to them, and I figured out, oh my God, so the situation was different for them. So I wanted to show the work of these new recent emigrated artists next to the work of them. And also I found there are some other Iranian Americans in the school who actually want to kind of be shown as Iranian, but maybe they don't speak Persian. So these like people who were my third group, kind of like those whose parents moved to the U.S. during the revolution, but like some of them even haven't been to Iran, but Iran was a kind of like heaven for them. So I also wanted to show the work of them next to those two groups.
Yeah, it seems like the SAIC was kind of the germ of the idea, the artists who had studied there, and then it became one of sort of networks of different ways in which the SAIC emanated outward.
Right, and then the title sedentary fragmentation came from all these conversations that I had with these artists, that they weren't aware of the change that is happening in their work. They were saying like, we can't make work, or like we are kind of so nothing is coming out. But when when they were making works after this like period of time, they could see the change in their works. So it was a kind of like fragmentation, but which was very slow and sedentary.
And what's happened to these archives, or this material that you
So
gathered?
that was so I showed them, and thanks to Anita Al-Khas, daughter of Hannibal Al-Khas, I showed them, and she was very supportive of the exhibition. So I proposed her to digitize them, but again the question came, how should I select to what digitize and to not digitize? So I've been in conversation with her to kind of digitize.
But they returned to her.
Yeah,
They
that's-
belong
yeah.
to her. In Milwaukee.
Milwaukee. And also I found an archive of him in Tehran, so I went to his studio, which is kept by his son, and everything is the same there. Like, so that was why I was so impressed by his archive, and I was like, no one has done anything for him.
Have you thought of doing a publication or just of these archival materials or selections of the archival
We
materials?
did a publication for the exhibition, a catalog that we did, but not yet like for the whole archive. No, I haven't.
Kimia,
But
can you talk a bit more about your experience? It seems to me so much of this is about authorship and ownership, right? People who have been saving materials, I think, likely want the credit for having the foresight to do that, actually. And so I'm just wondering, when you sort of turned up and are doing these interviews and are proposing having some kind of archive, what issues came up as far as that? Not, you talked a lot about people not knowing what an archive was, but you also talked about, especially the private galleries, doing their own archiving or recognizing the value. But what other kind of things?
So I have kind of like analyzed all those interviews, and like I have bullet points. The first thing was a financial thing. Like they were kind of, so when things were getting serious, they were asking about like money, or for instance, they were saying, okay, if you want to do that, so you definitely need financial help, and we don't have that financial thing. If, like, for instance, as I mentioned, if a foundation, for instance, Iran Heritage from UK, if they sponsor like digitizing or showing these, we are ready to do that. So if you find a solution for financial aspect, so then it's okay. But in terms of kind of like authorship, I guess representation in like outside of Iran is really something is very important. But I would say now even representation inside Iran is something which is people kind of value. For instance, the exhibition that we had for Kanun, the Children Foundation in Iran recently had an exhibition in Terra Museum of Contemporary Art about the whole history, and Ali Akbar Sadeghi exhibition, which is happening now. So there are like something, I guess, that has changed after 2015 and 16, like all those places that I showed. And I guess like something is happening, like this change is happening. But the time that I did my interview, the financial thing was the main important thing.
I mean, that's the thing about thinking of archives' future. You know, we think of archive as a repository of the past, but there's also this future. And so when things change, art worlds change, especially in these kinds of countries, where suddenly you have an influx of galleries or new or and maybe, you know, different materials come in and so forth. So it changes things too, and then it changes how an archive can be conceived. You know.
Yeah.
How much do you think a role friction plays into making an archive? Like what are the voids that we encounter while putting together an archive? How much of it can be filled with the idea of fiction? How much of it can be fictionalized?
Like fiction?
You're talking to an artist, so
You mean like you would be able to invent gaps, like if there are gaps
because when you're
in
basically
the
building an archive, there are a lot of
gaps.
a lot of voids.
So you need to
So
fill
how do
those
you-
gaps.
yeah, because
you don't need to, but you can.
You can.
Very creatively.
Yeah.
No, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Because
Do you think? What do you think? What do you think about filling gaps?
With,
I
with imagination.
All right.
Maybe I can respond to that a little bit, because I think it's a very good question, and it's something that we think about at Asia Art Archive. We actively invite artists to come to the archive, to intervene in the archive. And because we think that that is a very productive and interesting and fun way, but particularly a productive way of activating the archives and asking questions around that. Because sometimes we don't even know what the gaps are. I mean, what I often think about is what's not there. You know, after all these years that we've been doing this, and we can talk about, you know, that sort of history and how it's evolved and what our what our situation is now. I mean, how we started and where we are now is very, very different. The problems, the concerns, the sensitivities in our archive, and our recognition of where we have to do better or where we're going, is very different than where we were at the stage that you're at now. But one of the ways we can think through some of those issues is invite artists into the archive, because they look at things very differently. From me as an art historian who's constantly trying to pin things down, to try to prove things, to put citations everywhere, so that we're building very firm ground. But at the same time, what we may be doing is creating another fiction. I mean, we're creating these fictions out of what we believe to be truths.
Yeah, because somewhere I think the holisticness of the archive itself also lies within how one archive can give birth to another. Because when you build an archive, you're potentially building a situation which can create pregnant spaces.
Right.
And I feel in that sense the fiction plays a very important role to kind of to keep the archive floating,
alive,
breathing in a way.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, because you can't operate on the principle that the archive is the only truth out there.
There's no.
It can't be, or a truth even. So of course, art historians are live on fiction, because we are creating that fiction. It has truth in it, but we're also writing something that is very hypothetical.
Story.
It's a story, a narrative, and so forth. So you're already you're drawing from the archive, yes. But there, of course, you're only telling one fragment of that story by writing it. The archive is still there for others, to do something else with it. Yeah.
And one of the things that we found, and we've had several artists come to the archive, and we're always absolutely amazed as to what comes out of it. The archive Nisha came, and she did a whole set of projects, and they continue, it seems. In her own practice, what's really interesting is how her practice has developed around this exercise that she did for us, but also our understanding of what we actually had has been really informed by what she didn't find and what she looked at within the archive. It was an archive of, we have a very robust archive of teachers, professors, teachers, artists from Baroda, which was a certain school in India. And those teachers now are in their late 60s, early 70s probably, maybe even older. And we have a very strong archive of a lot of material. You'd think it was very comprehensive. We have thousands of pieces of material. But she did a whole project about the letter that we never found. That was the name of her project. And what it was relating to was all the relationships, all the friendships, all the romances that were embedded in all these documents that we have scanned. And there was a letter she imagined that nobody ever found that would somehow inform or be the the key or the clue to how all these relationships between people within this school, within this art movement in some way, were created. And it was a very interesting process. But again, it revealed to us about the gaps. It reminded us of the gaps, and also reminded us that these are human beings that had relationships and that had friendships, and sometimes those friendships went awry, and sometimes they developed into romance and marriage.
Or she found another story in the
and she found a
archive.
totally different story than we were focusing on. We were looking at the history of art. Right? So I mean, I think it's a really good point, and we need to be ever mindful that what we are actually doing is creating stories.
But that's what the Cambodia example taught me too, is that there's absence, and an archive can have absence too. It can be non-existent in a way.
Well, we can go on and on this. I mean, you want to talk to me about my favorite topic. But we're exactly an hour, and we like to keep these things short and sweet, so you'll come back and you don't get bored. So we want to let people leave hungry rather than leave overly full and falling asleep. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Kimia. Thank you.